All righty. Well, thank you, Angie, our panelists. Incredibly helpful to understand the progress that's being made towards our greenhouse gas emissions reductions in these key sectors, and to be shown, strategies and examples of how this is being addressed in other communities. And obviously, really a lot to watch and engage in the next several very crucial, critical years as we've really understand massive reductions and advancements needed in the next 10 years, time starting yesterday. I'm now pleased to introduce our next panel titled It's All Connected. We've heard a lot about housing and development, redevelopment strategies, kind of, references to the topic. Now we have a panel that's focused on this. Connected housing and community development amid the climate crisis. This panel explores some of the greatest challenges before us as we consider the combined issues of housing affordability, climate impacts, and equity. To lead this discussion, we've invited Dr. Colin Polsky to serve as moderator with several prominent panelists who are deeply embedded in these issues in our community. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Polsky and our panelists. Thank you.
Jennifer, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Huh? Okay. So welcome to the low blood sugar portion of the afternoon. Thanks to the chef for that ridiculous pound cake. We're going to try and keep things awake and lively here. I'm Colin Polsky, Director of the Center for Environmental Studies at Florida Atlantic University, also professor in the Department of Geosciences. Don't know anything about affordable housing, so it's a great opportunity for me to learn from some folks who do. In academia, we have, in the literature on the human dimensions of climate change, we have a concept from Lyshenko and O'Brien called double exposure. And it's a rather simple notion that climate change, of course, is unfolding in any given place, not in a vacuum. Instead, there are other things happening that might be, representing the strength of the location or maybe an additional vulnerability. And in our case, for anybody who lives here, you probably already know housing is not very affordable, and it's getting less so, especially in recent years. So today, here, it's the intersection between climate change and affordable housing. So on your app, you have the bios of our esteemed panelists, so I won't go into detail on them, but I will briefly introduce them. And first to my left, we have former State Senator Nan Rich, who's currently a commissioner on the Broward County Commission. She also co-chairs with Beam for the Climate Change Task Force for Broward County, and she's worked on affordable housing issues as well as climate for some time. Welcome to Senator Rich. To her left, we have Dr. Jermaine Smith-Baugh, who's president and CEO of the Broward County Urban League. And her perspective, I think, will be particularly helpful as we try to make this intersection and see where there are some opportunities where we can all pool our efforts. Welcome to Dr. Smith-Baugh. To her left is Dr. Ned Murray from Florida International University. He works in a leadership role at the Metropolitan Center, and it's a unit that's responsible for some studies on, among other things, the future land use, land cover, and housing demand in the state, or at least in this part of the state. And we'll hear some of the prognostications from his perspective in a moment. Thank you, Dr. Murray. And last but not least, to his left, we have Doug Coward, who is president and CEO, I believe, of SELF, Solar Energy Loan Fund. And this is, in my view, one of the new examples, relatively new, and hopefully there will be more of them in the space that's kind of bridges nonprofit and for-profit finance-based groups to try and help us out of this difficult situation that we find ourselves in. So we're going to all be learning a lot here. So why don't I kick this off? Senator Rich, we'll start with you. You've been one of the most vocal advocates for affordable housing in programs on the state and local levels in your roles as former state senator and currently as county commissioner, as I said. What context do you have for this discussion, again, at the intersection between climate change and affordable housing? And I'm going to try to be strict on the time limit here because I want to make sure we have an opportunity for questions. So, Senator.
Thank you. Thank you, Colin, and thank you to panel members. I have to say I'm especially happy that our friend Ned Murray from Florida International University is here. He is doing lots of the background work, the leg work that's preparing us for a lot of good things that are hopefully going to be happening with affordable housing. Affordable housing has been a priority of mine since I was in the state legislature when we were trying to prevent the sweeps of the Sadowski Trust Fund. That goes back to actually 2002 was when they first started sweeping the trust fund. So it's not surprising that this is a priority of mine on the Broward County Commission. I just want to mention that I'm going to talk about a few things that we've been able to accomplish and then a few statistics. In 2018, the Broward County Commission, well, first I'd like to just mention that we passed, many of you who are from Broward County here, we passed the Broward County Affordable Housing Trust Fund back in 2018. And that goes along with one of the recommendations that Dr. Murray makes about the fact that we need a dedicated source of revenue for affordable housing. That is really one of the most important things. We still don't have it. We do have the trust fund, and I want to say that prior to 2018, the highest amount of money that the county had put into affordable housing was $250,000 in a year. To date, we have put in $100 million in affordable housing dollars into the Broward County Trust Fund, and you have to know that it's a lockbox. The voters voted for something that's a true lockbox, and the money stays there, and it can only be used for affordable housing. In 2018, the Commission contracted with the FIU Metropolitan Center for our first affordable housing needs assessment. And Dr. Murray obviously led that. At that time, we were in affordable housing crisis. Now, we have the results from the updated study after the pandemic. And now, in his words, we have moved from crisis to catastrophe. And we are the most cost-burdened metro area, not only in our state, but in our country. We have the highest number of cost-burdened households that we've had in our history, those spending more than 30% of their income on housing. There are 154,722 cost-burdened renter individuals, of which 80,000 of those are severely cost-burdened, which means they're spending 50% of their income on that. So, and there is a shortage of approximately 150,000 units. The median price of a home in Broward was $360,000 in 2018. According to the Board of Realtors, it is now $565,000. And that means that less than 8% of Broward residents can afford to purchase a home in Broward County. And the average rent went from $1,902 for a two-bedroom apartment in 2018 to between $2,500 and $3,000. That's a 20 to 30% increase in 2022. So you can see the situation that we have here. Housing costs outpaced wages for many occupations. The median wage in Florida is $18.23 an hour. A full-time year-round worker with this wage can afford a $948 a month rent. These are just a few of the devastating statistics, and there are many more findings, but it just is pointing to the fact that this is a humanitarian and an economic crisis in our community. How much time do I have left? 1 minute, okay. Here are some of the steps that I'd like to mention that we have taken. I won't get to them all. Hopefully, I'll get to them a little bit later. But in last February, the county funded 9 projects totaling 1,025 units, supported by $47 million in gap financing, which leveraged approximately $308 million of private equity. That $47 million came from the Biden administration as part of the American Rescue Plan, and we were able to use that for affordable housing. More recently, the board approved our 23 budget, and we put $18 million from the general fund into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. We have already spent $11.8 million on that because we needed to provide gap financing for another 4 proposed projects, which will build approximately 500 additional units. And many of you know that construction prices have gone up, and that's why it's so important that we have our trust fund and that we are able to take that money and use it for individual developments where the construction costs have gone up so much. Okay, I'll finish a little later.
Thank you, Senator. Turning now to Dr. Smith-Baugh. As President and CEO of the Urban League of Broward County, you're well connected with the community of partners and community of need in working to address housing and other challenges. So what is your perspective on this question?
Thank you, Colin. My perspective should be to yield time back to the commissioner. Would be good, right? Well, good afternoon, everyone. I really want to thank you for the opportunity to join in this conversation around the intersectionality of housing, and particularly affordable housing and climate change. And I would suspect, as Dr. Murray will share, by the data and our own pocketbooks, in this region, we have been established that we are in a housing crisis or catastrophe, depending on what word we want to use. But it is definitely exaggerated by the rapid changes in our climate and the extreme results of that. The Urban League of Broward County, Colin, as you mentioned, is a community-based not-for-profit organization. We serve over 14,000 children and families on an annual basis. To what Commissioner Rich said, we serve those cost-burdened individuals. Those are our families. Those are the individuals that come through our doors every day. And we serve them in a variety of ways through direct service, research, thought leadership, advocacy in the areas of health, education, entrepreneurship, jobs and justice, and yes, housing. The Urban League of Broward County and our subsidiary, we are a developer of affordable housing in Broward County of various topologies. So as a we are actually poised as a non-government organization in the pre-development phase at this point to deliver the largest number of affordable housing topologies, close to about 400 plus units on a contiguous approximately 20 acres of property that is currently under our control. And that property is located in what some experts would call Black middle neighborhoods. And this intersectionality of affordability and housing and climate change is truly a real consideration for us as we go through this development process. And as I share these couple of points, I want to be really clear that as I'm speaking to you as a region, as an audience, I'm also speaking to myself and my team. And one of the things that as we reimagine communities that are predominantly Black and brown, I would suggest to us that creating greater awareness, understanding, and action for residents and stakeholders are imperatives around this issue. Because I can tell you that resiliency, climate change, many of the things that we've been talking about over these last 2 days are not living room conversation, dining room table conversations for many in our community. And if we truly want to create a sense of urgency, we're going to have to deploy strategies and tactics that go from the grassroots to the grass tops. It can't just be one way. The second point that I wanted to share as I think through this intersectionality is, needless to say, the challenge of making housing affordable in this market is already a financial nightmare. I've been penciling it left, right, and center, and I do have really, really bad dreams about it. But I will tell you, adding the intentionality regarding green and resilient homes, as well as resilient built environments, sometimes seems near to impossible. But I guarantee you that if we don't get intentional, if we don't begin to be disruptive about the way that we're thinking about this intersectionality, given our historic housing and community development policies, communities of color will once again bear the brunt of being overlooked. And this will not be acceptable in a county and in a region that is dominated by people of color. We cannot reimagine resilient built environments in the more affluent pockets of our region and leave middle neighborhoods in the central, downtown, or those gutted by overpasses discounted and ignored. There must be ways for us to marry housing affordability and resiliency for all communities. And what we're discovering is that we want to ensure that resiliency is not just a matter of checking off items when we think about building, community development and building, but working closely with design teams to be able to really think through elements that balance resiliency as well as community connection. So Colin, I think I'm at time, so I will defer.
Outstanding. Thank you. I think that was a sobering call to arms, and if we want to get even more depressed, maybe now, Dr. Murray, what do you see from your center's reports?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here, and certainly an honor to be on the same stage with people I've come to know, and a real champion in Senator Nan Rich. When you look up champion in the dictionary, you'll see her picture, because there is no bigger champion. And I've had the pleasure over the last 2 years working with Jermaine and the Urban League of Broward and Hispanic Unity to develop two very important reports that you can find on their websites, one on the state of Black Broward and the other on the state of Hispanic Broward. If you haven't seen them, you really need to read those, because that gets into a lot of the equity issues that Jermaine was just referring to, but also a really interesting segue into this conference and panel as this all relates to the climate crisis. The timing couldn't be better. I think a good chunk of you probably know that Broward County has embarked on a 10-year affordable housing master plan to address the very issues that Senator Rich was talking about. We've now, gotten into a period after many years of what we would call a housing crisis to something that does take us to a whole other level, and catastrophe is certainly a good term for that, because I think you all know what's been happening over the last 2 years. You've probably either been directly or indirectly impacted by housing, the rise in housing costs and what's going on in the housing market more generally. So the update of the housing needs assessment that was just done, working with the Broward Housing Council and certainly supported by Senator Rich and the entire leadership of Broward County has been fantastic in supporting these efforts, not just now, but over the years. But the question did come up. I mean, enough is enough. We have to start figuring out solutions, just as we're trying to figure out solutions to the climate crisis. And obviously, they're all intertwined. And that's a really important thing to understand, going back to what Jermaine was just talking about. What was going through my head as she was talking was environmental justice. And we know with some of the studies we've done, and we've been working with various groups throughout South Florida right now on those issues. Some of the areas of South Florida, in fact, most of the areas that are most vulnerable to the climate crisis and sea level rise are the same distressed communities economically that Jermaine was just talking about. So with that master plan, let me just say this: we are doing a traveling tour right now. I think we've had 4 or 5 community-wide meetings in the past couple of weeks. We'll continue to do that. Please jump on board at one of them. Get in touch with Sandra Vesey at the Broward Collaborative to find out where the next one is. But we've been talking about the master plan and how the master plan has to address this particular issue, but also the opportunities the master plan has for also connecting with the environment, connecting with other issues relative to land use, transportation, infrastructure, all the things that we need to be talking about if we're going to really be thinking not only in terms of how we address the affordable housing issue, but ultimately, if we are talking about serious issues relative to supply, and then ultimately construction and preservation of what we have left, where does that happen, and how does that happen from an environmental standpoint? As I just said, most of these areas that are most distressed are those communities that are already economically distressed. Let me just give you a number that's really kind of scary. We just presented this as part of the Broward Housing, the 2022 Broward County Affordable Housing Needs Assessment. If you look at the number of structures in Broward County, only 4% have been constructed since 2010. 86% were built prior to 2000, which means prior to the Florida Building Code. Now, we've already done an analysis of this in Miami-Dade County to get a sense of how many buildings, how many structures, and of course their associated units were built going back each decade prior to both the Florida Building Code and, of course, there was the Miami-Dade, South Florida Building Code prior to that, after Hurricane Andrew, and then begin looking at structures in terms of their values and the upgrades that have occurred or not occurred over that period. And I can tell you in the case of Miami-Dade, there are 278,000 units that would be considered highly vulnerable to an extreme weather event. 278,000 units and about 800,000 people, a population of about 800,000. Think about that. And we mapped it. And you can imagine where that mapping led us to. The neighborhoods, communities that Jermaine was just talking about. We just completed Broward County. We haven't done the mapping yet, but we know that 710,000 units were built prior to the Florida Building Code, and that would suggest to us, if it's anything close to what the numbers showed in Miami, is we are probably talking in the neighborhood of a couple 100,000 units, and in a population of upwards of 500,000 that would be highly vulnerable to extreme storm events. So that kind of lays it out in terms of why it's so critical that we do a master plan that takes into all these issues today that perhaps we wouldn't have done, some years ago. But a master plan today has to be aware and inclusive of all the environmental issues and, of course, the economic issues and a lot of these other issues because this is a great opportunity to do that. And you got to remember, too, and I made this point this morning with another group, is that when you look at housing in a more general standpoint, in terms of the housing market and the housing industry, there are some real opportunities there for economic development and creating jobs in the area of not only construction, but so many other areas where we can address not only the affordable housing crisis, but a lot of what's happening relative and what we need to do as we move beyond mitigation to actually begin building a more resilient community here in South Florida. Well, so these are all real important aspects of what we're currently doing, and we welcome your involvement and support in that effort. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And so let's start to discuss a way out, perhaps, of this challenge that we face, namely through finance. So Mr. Doug Coward, you are the CEO of SELF, Solar Energy Loan Fund. I believe you might want to even call that a climate bank. Correct me if I'm wrong. What do you guys offer, and what do you do, and what do you see as the future opportunities?
Great. Thank you, Colin. And good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor for me to be here as a part of the 14th Annual Southeast Florida Regional Leadership Summit. I'm also honored to be on this distinguished panel to discuss affordable and workforce housing and the intersect with climate change. And I would just start with an opening comment that low and moderate income communities are generally the most susceptible to climate change, whether we're talking about heat waves or severe storms, rising energy costs, rising insurance costs. But they've also participated and benefited the least from the fast emerging clean energy economy. And so what I and others tried to do in St. Lucie County was essentially create the first and only nonprofit green bank in Florida with the goal of knocking down the technical and financial barriers and filling critical financial gaps, particularly for underserved and underbanked communities, with the objective of helping those homeowners and renters achieve energy efficiency, clean energy, and resilience. And we ended up creating this nonprofit green bank back in 2009 when local communities such as St. Lucie County were fighting off coal plants. And there were no meaningful clean energy policies in the state. So it was really, just out of pure frustration that we decided we would create our own, the first local government green bank in America, to try and kickstart the creation of the clean energy economy from the bottom up, helping primarily poor and working class families. And so the county sought and received a $3 million grant from the Obama administration back in 2009, and we created the SELF organization and spun it off as a nonprofit community development financial institution, basically the first green CDFI in America. And SELF is also one of the only green banks in America that is focused exclusively on LMI homeowners. And as such, we've become a national leader in energy equity, and we've achieved an astounding 74% LMI penetration rate, meaning 3 out of every 4 projects we finance are in working class areas. And thank you. How we achieve this energy equity is primarily through what I would describe as financial inclusion, which means that our underwriting policies are based on the applicant's ability to pay, not credit scores. And there's an estimated 30 to 40% of the U.S. population that cannot access traditional financing. So if the AC breaks during a heat wave or your roof needs repairs during a hurricane, most LMI homeowners don't have sufficient savings, and they may not have adequate credit scores to obtain financing. So they're basically forced to either suffer the consequences, or they may have to use a credit card at 25 to 30% interest, or other predatory lenders that can be even worse. So SELF is filling this financial gap, and we're typically saving our clients 10 to 20% on their interest rates as well. And most often we're financing high-efficiency ACs, roof repairs and replacements, and what I would broadly describe as sustainable building practices that include everything from rooftop solar, septic to sewer conversions. We even have special programs for people with disabilities. And as a mission-driven lender, one of SELF's biggest strengths is the ability to raise low-cost capital from a variety of different sources, including global crowdfunding through Kiva.org. We're one of their partners in North America. We get bank CRA investments. We're able to work with faith-based investors, impact investors, foundation PRIs, and the list goes on. And essentially what we do is we blend private, philanthropic, and government capital so that we can then re-lend that money at below market rate to specifically help underbanked LMI homeowners. In addition, the property improvements themselves are also cutting energy costs generally 20-25%. We're reducing insurance bills. We're enhancing the health, safety, and livability of the homes. And we're also creating home equity and generational wealth, which is critically important as well. And these are unsecured personal loans. There's no prepayment penalties, and there are no liens like PACE that could endanger home ownership if you default on those loans. So just summarizing very quickly, we've now expanded the Green Home Loan Program from 1 county in Florida to we are now operating in 4 states. We're in Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina, and we're a few months away from opening up Texas and Tennessee. We've now surpassed $30 million in projects with an average loan size of just under $10,000, which translates to us helping about 3,000 different homeowners and assisting close to 10,000 people so far during our journey. We've also built burgeoning partnerships with local governments. We serve as an implementation tool for them. So we're proud of our partnerships with St. Pete, Hillsborough, Orlando, Orange County, and then most recently we're working with Miami-Dade County right now. In fact, we're hiring a loan officer if there's anyone interested. But we work with local government partners to help us penetrate these targeted areas and get the word out to the community. And I'll just close by saying that over the last 12 years, SELF has used the green home loans to retrofit existing affordable housing, single-family homes, townhouses, condos, and even mobile homes. But the co-leader of the organization, also my wife, Duana Andrade, has also developed new lending programs. So we now have new lending products for landlords. We have gap financing for affordable housing developers. So I'm going to want to talk to Jermaine more about her work. And we've even set up new lending products that we work with utilities on. So we're essentially becoming a one-stop shop for green financing, and we hope to continue to retrofit existing affordable housing, but also build new sustainable and resilient affordable housing in the future. So we're poised to further expand in Florida, and we're also strategically going to be expanding throughout the United States in the coming years as well. So I appreciate, again, the opportunity to be here.
Thank you, sir. That's some information I think that many people are going to be happy to hear and learn more about. And so now we're entering into our rapid fire round, and I want to return to Senator Rich here and ask you to comment on the quality of the housing stock that we have here in Broward and elsewhere that you may be familiar with, particularly as it relates to the climate stressors that we're often talking about, heat and urban flooding.
I do want to say that I hope that some of what I'm saying, even though it's the experience is mostly in Broward County, that I think it's relevant to everybody because Florida is, all 67 counties really at this point are suffering from the issues of a shortage of affordable housing. So, and I'll just follow what some of the things that Dr. Murray was talking about. He mentioned about the aging of the stock, which definitely can impact the longevity and safety of housing. Deferred maintenance, as we know, Surfside is an example of that. Many condos are impacted in that way. And I also want to mention, though, that we're also losing units. This is part of what came up in the needs assessment, the updated one. We're losing units every year. So in 2020, 15,711 home-owned units were lost, 9,602 rental. So that's very often due to market rate going up. We know the increases in rent and then also in cost of housing. So when things become market rate, then they go off the market as obviously being affordable housing. So we need a supply, we need stabilization as well. And I have to say, it's tough to get in Florida because when we talk about stabilization, we think about rent control. And it's pretty much preempted. I just want to remind people that in Orlando, the item on the ballot that had the highest votes that it received was the issue on rent control of all the things that were on the ballot in November. So it shows you that people are willing, to support that because it's not just about a small group of people. I know people very often talk about firefighters, police, teachers. Definitely, they're in the category. But you have to look at, and Jermaine certainly knows this, I mean, everybody, we are a tourist-based economy here. We have a lot of people that work in that field. it's just across the board now where you're finding issues with regard to affordable housing. So I just want to mention that. And also, we can mitigate some of the structures. Some of the things we're looking at are replacement of windows, doors with impact glass and so forth. We have to be focusing on older neighborhoods with gentrification. Development, we're working already with many of the developers in the design community to take climate change into consideration. And also educating buyers about flood zones and also builders. We have examples of places in this country where communities have been evacuated. With the word retreat, people don't like to hear that too much, but sometimes it's really wrong to keep building in the same place and using government funding to do it. And then the next hurricane that comes along, the same thing happens. And I think, thank you. I've been talking about that for about 8 years, and people mostly when I first started, they gasp. But we have it in Florida. We have the Florida Keys. In Louisiana, they moved a whole community of people, and incidentally low-income people, and they built a community for them because they couldn't keep them safe any longer on the barrier islands there. So I think these are all things that we have to look at, and also we have to encourage more involvement of our municipalities. Unlike Dade, they have much more unincorporated land. We're pretty much incorporated into 31 cities. We have about 5 cities that are really pretty stellar in terms of supporting us with affordable housing, but we have a lot of work to do in that category as well.
Thank you. And so, again, in the spirit of trying to make sure we have time for questions, I want to ask our remaining commenters to be concise. Mr. Coward, you mentioned a word, I think, inclusive banking. Right. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes. One of the keys to our success in promoting energy equity is our work in financial inclusion. And a lot of people may not fully get what that means. So I wanted to give kind of a specific example. We had a homeowner in Fort Pierce whose roof was severely damaged by Hurricane Irma. They had to move out of the house. They're living in a hotel. FEMA cut them a check for $5,000, but the roof repairs cost $10,000. He had a 0 credit score and was unable to secure financing from traditional financing. If you haven't worked in the sector, your instinct is, well, he probably, defaulted on every loan in his life and deserved that. Well, the reality is quite different. He actually owned his home, had no mortgage payments. He had worked all his life, had retirement income and the ability to pay, but he had not used credit since 1994 and therefore had not established a credit score. So traditional financing will completely bypass this individual, and as a result, they sat in a hotel for over a year with FEMA paying them to continue to do this. They finally learned about SELF. He applied for a loan, and when we looked at his credit history, we realized he was credit worthy and had the ability to pay. So we gave him a $5,000 loan with a 0 credit score so he could match those dollars with FEMA, get the roof repaired, get his family out of the hotel, back and home, off of FEMA's dime, and put a local contractor back to work at the same time. That's the essence of financial inclusion. I would just broadly, if I could make one statement, as we try and achieve energy equity in the state of Florida and beyond, a lot of times I think people think we need to throw money at it and it's going to be solved through grants. And I think that's an example that shows you where grants are part of the solution, and they're going to be particularly useful for very low-income people who do not have the ability to pay. But if you combine financial inclusion with those grant programs, you're going to be able to leverage your dollars and be able to achieve so much more. So I appreciate you asking that follow-up question.
Thank you. That's really very interesting. I wanted to return to Dr. Smith-Baugh, and I have a double-barreled question, which means you can answer either or neither. But I wanted picking up on a couple of themes. One is renters. So much of the conversation here, as well as elsewhere that I've seen, says, well, people have a tough time buying. It makes sense. But if they have a tough time buying, then they're probably in the renter category, especially in recent years here. So what hope do you see in your experience for that community? The second thing I wanted to pick up on is we've talked a lot about data and numbers here, which is great. But where you live and the ability to be stable in your home is one of the more fundamental, I think, human needs. And so there's an emotional and well-being dimension to this. And if you had any reflections on that, I think it'd be great to hear.
I have a reflection on both. And I really, as you were telling the story of the gentleman, the second question that you asked is what played in my mind. The instability that family had for an entire year living in a hotel. I barely am in a hotel for 3 days and I'm ready to go home. Right? So, to your point, the first point about renters, we have a strong belief that when we think about housing and housing affordability is that we have to run the spectrum. There has to be great intentionality about mixed ages, mixed ownership, so going from renting to home ownership, and even putting into the atmosphere shared equity, lease to own options. We have to come up with a lot of different ways because, to your point, ultimately, we want to create an equitable place for our families to be able to live and to thrive. Because a home is not just a structure. It's not just X amount of square feet. It is where that's the place where at some point in time you've made a connection that is where, I'm connected. That's who I am. That's a part. And so many of our families, so many of our children don't know are we staying here for this month and then going somewhere else? I was sharing with my daughter very quickly. My daughter is 15. She had to pick a topic, Senator Rich. Maybe because I keep talking about housing, she picked that topic. And then she started doing some research, like, Mom. And she started going through the information. And I said, do you know how blessed you are? That the only home you have ever known is this one address, one you can barely remember, but nonetheless, right? Your one address. And we have to really remember as we think about all the policies, when we think about the programs that we put into place, that this is our opportunity as a community to say that we want to create safe, affordable, nurturing places for our children to live and to grow.
Well, thanks for that. One of my goals was to end at 5 minutes till, which we're at. And so I'll ask, while I make a final comment, reflecting on these comments, anybody who wants to go to the microphones. Okay, it's hard to see over there for me, but all right, we'll get to you in a moment. Basically, the just launching point for me is, the incentives for individual homeowners or someone in the homeowner market are about their income and other characteristics. But if they're a renter, the target population, it seems to me, are the owners of the buildings. And so how do we incentivize them on these climate retrofits is a looming question. But over here, let's turn to, over here, please identify yourself and ask your question.
Hi, my name is Natalia Beaufort. I'm from Miramar High School. My question is, what do you think would be the best solution to future flooding due to rising sea levels?
I'll try and paraphrase. It was hard for me to hear. I think you said what might be our opinions of the best solutions in housing to rising sea levels?
The best, yes.
Great. So anybody have a particular answer to that question? Well, thinking of housing and retrofitting or with new housing, how to make it more resistant and resilient to rising sea levels, flood risk.
Well, we have to do both. You heard the numbers I provided in terms of the vulnerability of structures, and a good many of those obviously can be retrofitted. But we really need to do a vulnerability assessment, an inventory. I think each county needs to do that so we can get a better sense of the cost, how many units, and the cost. But at the same time, we do need to be thinking about construction, and we need to do it right. We can no longer be building in obviously highly vulnerable areas. So part of the master plan I was referring to, and as was Senator Nan Rich, is we have to be thinking longer term. Obviously, we have to mitigate against the built environment right now, which obviously has some real issues to it in terms of the properties that are located there. But longer term, in terms of creating a more resilient community, we need to be thinking of construction, affordable construction, green construction in locations that obviously are not, primed to obviously sea level rise or anything else. So.
Thank you.
There's no silver. I think we have to be mindful that it's going to take a very comprehensive approach.
Very nice. So on this side of the room, please.
So since housing in cities is very high, people are going to like suburban areas, right? So has there ever been any thought to like retrofitting existing homes, replacing like gas-powered appliances with just electric ones? That, in theory, should reduce housing costs, right, generally? Has there ever been any thought of that?
Does anybody want to take that question? Very thoughtful question. So it's essentially, if I understand you correctly, what may have been done already regarding plans or programs to retrofit homes to be more energy efficient? Is that fair?
Yeah.
Well, I can say for Broward County does have programs actually for helping people and supporting them when they, change, say, like their toilets and things like that for upgrading. We also have other opportunities through the county for some help in retrofitting. I wouldn't say, it's an answer to what you're talking about. It kind of leads me, though, to something that I wanted to say, because we are a built-out community here, and this is part of what the problem is. We have counties that have plenty of land left and plenty of area to build, but we don't. And what we're trying to do here is to look at figuring out a way to be able to build more multifamily housing. It doesn't take away from the fact of what Jermaine was saying about home ownership, but when you're a built-out county like ours, it's very, very difficult. And one of the things I would like to say is we're working with the Florida legislature, with the legislators, to see if we can change the formula for the Sadowski Fund, because that fund, that formula was created in 1992 when you didn't have built-out counties like we have today. And the formula says that any money coming out of the Sadowski Fund, minimum of 65% has to go to home ownership. That doesn't work. That doesn't work for our county. It doesn't work for Hillsborough or Palm Beach or some of the other counties. It does work for some more rural counties. So what we're asking them to do is to change that formula to a 50-50, to have the flexibility to go to that 50-50 split if that's the need in your community. And that's what we should be focusing on. What is the need in each of the 67 counties? And make the law flexible enough so that we can do what we need to do here, but someone who's in a rural community can still keep 65% plus in single-family housing. So that's, and if everyone here I know is involved with their legislative delegations in their own communities, please share that with them and ask them where we've been trying last year, and now we have a new Senate president, Senator Pasadomo, who is interested in this. So everybody should let her know from all around the state that we would like to see that formula changed, because that will help all of us to be able to use more money that's coming from the state to be able to be used, and gap financing to be able to be used for multifamily housing.
Well, thank you. I see the hook is rapidly approaching, and I just want to leave with one comment, and that is, it's one thing that strikes me is that some of the solutions that we may need to address this challenging intersection between climate change and affordable housing won't necessarily require new rocket science kind of inventions. It's stuff that has been done. It's just a question of doing it. And so now we have, a number of banks and the like that may help us get there. In any case, please join me in thanking our panel.